Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a very good night. Uh, to begin with, I hope everybody, wherever you are, are taking lot of precautionary measures against COVID. Please, I encourage you that you maintain the SOPs as prescribed by the Ministry of Health and the Government of the Republic of Uganda. Without wasting much time, last time we made a repeat of some of the work we had already covered about locomotion. It was a reason to people get back on board because we had spent some time without studying about the topic. So we talked about the different organisms and how they are able to carry out locomotion, especially the single-celled organisms. We moved as far as the other time we had moved as far as talking about the skeleton, then the different parts or components that make up the human skeleton or mammalian skeleton. The mammalian skeleton, we said, is divided into two parts, the appendicular and the exoskeleton, right? So I hope you remember that. Today, I want us to talk about the joints. I'm going to study about the joints, the mammalian joints. So by definition, we have to know what a joint is. What is a joint? What is a joint? This is a very familiar word to all of us. So a joint, we define it as a point where two or more bones meet and articulate. We define a joint as a point where two or more bones meet. A point where two or more bones meet or articulate. The different parts of our bodies where we have two bones meeting. For example, in your arm, we have this joining with this. So at a point where two bones meet, there's this bone joining with this. So we have a joint in between. Then we have this joining with the shoulder bone shoulder bone. So there's a joint here. So we define the joint as a point in the body where two or more bones meet or articulate. So what's the importance of these joints? The importance of the joints or the role of the joints in the body is to allow movement, right? They allow movement. So joints allow movement. They allow movement of the body. They allow movement of the body. Otherwise, if these joints were missing in the body, then movement would be a problem. So movement of body parts is brought about by the action of muscles on certain bones at specific points, right? So these joints allow movement, some degree of movement of the body because they allow flexibility. Having defined what a joint is, we can also talk about the different types of joints. So types of joints. Joints, we have basically two major types. We talk of a hinge joint. We talk of a ball and socket joint. One, hinge joint. What is a hinge joint? For each type of joint, you have to know what it means. So a hinge joints are joints that allow movement of bones in one plane only. These are joints which allow movement which allow movement of bones, in one plane only, in one plane only. An example of a hinge joint in the body. Can talk about the elbow. This one here. This is your elbow. It allows only movement in one direction, in one plane. That is an example of a hinge joint. So examples of hinge joints that allow movement in only one plane. We talk of the elbow joint, the elbow joint. Then you have your knee. Your knee here also allows movement in one direction. So the knee joint is another example of a hinge joint. So the movement they allow occurs in only one direction, right? So all these examples allow movement. They allow movement in only one direction. In only one direction. Right? You have the drawings of the structure of the knee joint and the parts that make up the knee joint. Then you also have the drawings of the structure that make up the elbow joint. So in reference to your notes, you can look at those drawings, the two drawings that you have of the knee joint, the parts there that are given. In between the joint, the important features or structures that you have to put into consideration. So among the features that form at the joint, you have cartilage. There. It's cartilage. Cartilage is a skeletal structure, a skeletal material, softer than bone. Then at the joint, you also have a fluid. You have a fluid such as synovial fluid. Synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is very important at joints because it prevents and provides a lubrication. This one provides lubrication. It provides lubrication between the points where the two bones meet. Provides a lubrication between the points where the two bones meet. To avoid rubbing and heating, right? Especially where the body is in action or in motion. So in reference to your notes, look at the two drawings of the knee joint and the elbow joint. The knee joint and the elbow joint. Those of you have just joined us. We are looking at joints today. The other time I took you through work we had already covered earlier. It was a point of reminding ourselves to avoid forgetting important concepts we had talked about as far as locomotion is concerned. So today we have decided to begin at a point. Remember, you had finished the mammalian skeleton. We had talked about the two components of the mammalian skeleton as the exoskeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So next we are supposed to look at joints. We have defined a joint as a point where two or more bones meet or articulate. Then we have also said the importance of joints, they allow movement of the body. Then the types of joints is where we are. So far we have mentioned the hinge joints. The hinge joint, we have said it's a joint, or these are joints which allow movement of bones in one plane only. And the example we have given of the hinge joint is the elbow. The elbow joint, then the knee joint, right? Then we have also said At the joints, you always find important features there, such as cartilage and a synovial fluid, the fluid known as synovial fluid. We have said the fluid is important in lubrication between the 2 points where the bones meet. To move on, hope you all have the drawings. Then the other second type of joint is the ball and socket joint. So number 2, you have ball and socket. Ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint. Ball and socket, as the name suggests, as the name given, ball and socket. That means at that joint you find a round structure fitting into a socket. That's why we call it ball and socket. So since there's a round structure that is hanging or fixed within a socket, it allows some bit of what? Movement. So ball and socket joints, to make it different from hinge joints, we define it as a joint. These are joints which allow movement. These are joints which allow movement in more than one plane. In more than one plane. In more than one plane. Like we did for this one, we need to know the examples of such joints that allow movement of the body in more than one plane. Take an example of the shoulder. Example of the part of the body where we find the ball and socket joints. Example, you have the shoulder joint. The shoulder joint, right? The shoulder joint gives us ball and socket joint. So ball and socket joint allow movement in many directions or 3 planes, including rotational movement. It allows rotational movement. So you can move it this way. You can also move it the other way around, right? In more than one plane. So in this type of joints, the end of one bone is round to form a ball. So the ends of one bone, the end of one bone is round to form a ball. To form a ball. It is round to form a ball, and the other end is hollowed. The other end is hollowed, and the other end is hollowed. It is hollowed. The other end is hollowed, or you can say it is shallow or cup-shaped. It is shallow or cup-shaped. The other end is hollowed, or it is cup-shaped, shallow and cup-shaped. Shallow and cup-shaped. Cup-shaped to form a socket. To form a socket. So the round part of the bone fits. The round part fits into that socket. So to allow that flexibility of movement, right, in many directions. So ball and socket joints allow the greatest flexibility. These ones, ball and socket. Ball and socket joints. Ball and socket joints allow the greatest flexibility. The greatest flexibility. They allow the greatest flexibility. They allow the greatest flexibility and freedom of movement and freedom of movement in all planes. In all planes. In all planes. It allows the greatest flexibility and movement in all planes. So those are the main types of joints. One, hinge joint. We have defined the hinge joint as a joint which allows movement of bones in one plane. The example of the hinge joint, we have given the elbow joint, which we have in the drawing, and the knee joint, which we also have in the drawing. Then we have said at the joints, some important features there. We have the cartilage and the fluid known as synovial fluid, which we have said the synovial fluid provides a lubrication between the points where the two bones meet. Then the second type of joint we have given ball and socket joints, and we have said it's a joint, or these are joints which allow movement in more than one plane, in many planes. Example, we have given the shoulder joint. The shoulder joint is an example. Then we also have the other example of the ball and socket joints, the hip joints, right? So the second example I can give is the hip joint. Hip joint. You can move your leg forward and backwards. So there's movement in between your hip girdle, hip region, right? So there is also another point where the end of the bone is round and fixed within a socket or a hollowed and shallow cup-shaped structure. We can as well add this if it's missing in your notes. Classification of joints. You can classify joints. Classification of 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 joints. Classify joints. So joints are classified based on the type of movement they allow. You can say joints are classified. They are classified according to the movements. According to the movements they bring about or they cause in the body. So they are classified according to the movements they allow. According to the movements they allow, or according, joints are also classified according to the degree of movements they can permit. According to the degree of movements they can permit. According to the degree of movements, according to the degree of movements they can permit. They can permit. So that is the way we classify joints. According to the movements they allow, or according to the degree of movements they can permit. That is one way. In this way of classifying joints, we have two types. The immovable joints. So there are two major classes. There are two major classes of joints according to the mode of classification, either according to the movement they allow or the degree of movement they can permit. So in this category, we have two major types. We can talk about the immovable joints or the fixed joints and the movable joints. So in this category, we have immovable. The immovable joints. Immovable joints. These ones can also be called the fixed joints. The fixed joints. Fixed joints. And the second category are the movable joints. Movable joints. movable joints, the movable joints, the fixed joints, and the movable joints. What's an immovable joint? What's a fixed joint? An immovable joint is a joint which cannot allow any form of movement. So immovable joints, immovable joints, immovable joints, immovable joints, or fixed joints. Fixed joints are the joints which do not allow any form of movement. They don't allow any form of movement. They are fixed, but they are joints, right? They are joints because they are bones meeting at a certain point. Since we defined a joint as an area or a place or a part where two bones meet. So these ones do not allow any form of movement, or they cannot allow any form of movement to take place. Examples of immovable joints. Examples of such joints. Examples we can mention, like the joints between the bones of the skull, joints between the bones of the skull, or the cranium, the joints between the bones of the skull or the cranium. The skull has, if you look at the drawing of the skeleton, they appear as if they are cracks, right? But those are joints. They appear as cracks. Those are joints, but they are fixed, right? Remember that the skull or the cranium encloses a very sensitive part of the body called the brain. So it needs a structure of the skeleton which is really hard, but allows some bit of degree of flexibility. So the joints between, or the joints that the skull or the cranium, are the ones that are immovable. Then we also have joints between the bones of the pelvic girdle, joints between the bones of the pelvic girdle, bones of the pelvic girdle, the joints between the bones of the pelvic girdle, the joints between the bones of the sacrum, joints between bones of the sacrum, pelvic girdle, and the sacrum. Those ones we have immovable joints. Then the second type of joint we have given is the movable joints. So movable joints, these ones allow movement, or they can permit any sort of movement. These are joints which permit, these ones permit any sort of movement. They permit any sort of movement. Movable joints permit any sort of movement. Movable joints, we can give examples as the gliding joints. Example, gliding joints. The gliding joints. These ones allow some little movement. They allow little movement, or they permit some limited movement. They permit movement side to side, back and forth movements. These ones permit little or limited movement, or side to side movement, or back and forth movement only. 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 Those ones are called the gliding joints. An example of a movable joint. Then the pivot joint. Maybe for that case, you can talk of the wrist. An example of a gliding joint is this one. Your wrist. Is this the wrist? Your wrist. At that area here, we have some, you can see back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So here we have a gliding joint. So the wrist or the carpals. Then we also have the same arrangement of the ankles here, right? Just below here. The foot joining with this long bone here. It is just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So we can give examples of such parts of the body where we have a gliding joint as the joint between bones at the wrist. Hinged joints between bones at the wrist. Joints between bones at the wrist. Spelling of wrist, the wrist, or the carpals. The carpals. The carpals. The carpals. The wrist, that one there. If you look at your drawing of the skeleton, there are wrist bones there. Small bones. Small stone-like bones. Those ones form the gliding joints. Then we also have the joints between bones at the ankle. That is one. Joints between bones at the ankle. At the ankle. At the ankle. They also give us that forth and back movement. They permit little movement either side to side, back and forth movement only. So that one is an example of a gliding joint. The pivot joint is another class of joints. The pivot joint. So I've given under movable joints, gliding. Another one is the pivot. So pivot is another example of a movable joint. Pivot joint. The pivot joint. Pivot joint. A pivot joint, we can define it as a joint which allows limited movement sideways. A joint which allows limited movement sideways. Limited movement sideways. Limited movement sideways. Limited movement sideways. Examples of pivot joints, the joints between the skull and the atlas. The skull and the atlas. E.g., the joint between the skull and the atlas. Between the skull and the atlas. Remember, we already talked about the structure of the human skeleton, mammalian skeleton. So if this is the skull region, the skull sits on a very large bone, right? Sits on a very large bone. That is the atlas bone, right? So there's some bit of movement between the skull or the head and another bone, large bone there on which the skull is seated or is fixed. So that joint there is also a pivot joint. An example of a pivot joint allows sideways movement. You can nod your head on the sides. Another example, besides the skull and the atlas, joint between the atlas and the axis. The joint, another example of a pivot joint, the joints between the atlas and the axis. Atlas and axis. These are two large bones that follow each other shortly after the skull. Then those are two examples of the pivot joints. Then we also have the synovial joints. The synovial joints and the movable joints. So under movable joints, also are adding something to the notes. Take note, under movable joints, we have mentioned the gliding joint, B, pivot joint, C, synovial joints. Synovial joints. The synovial joints. Synovial. Remember, I talked about the synovial fluid. Synovial joints. So, what are synovial joints? These are joints that allow a considerable degree of freedom of movement. Joints which allow a considerable degree of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement. And at such joints, there is a fluid. So at such joints, there is a fluid. There is a circulating fluid. We say the synovial fluid lubricates. So at such joints there is a fluid. At such joints there is a fluid called synovial fluid. Synovial fluid, basically for lubrication. For lubrication to avoid the two bones rubbing each other, to prevent. So the examples of synovial joints, again, we can mention what we already talked about as the ball and socket, and the hinge joints, right? And talk of the ball and socket as good examples of synovial joints. Ball and socket, and the hinge joint. Ball and socket and the hinge joints as good examples of synovial joints. So examples of synovial joints. Examples of synovial joints. You have Roman 1, ball and socket. That one we have already mentioned, ball and socket joints. And the ball and socket joint, we mentioned the shoulder. In between there is a fluid called synovial fluid. And then also mention the hinge joint. The hinge joint. So those are two examples of synovial joints. Joints which allow considerable degree of freedom of movement in different planes, and at such joints there is a fluid called synovial fluid, and the role of the synovial fluid is to provide a lubrication to prevent the joints from rubbing together. Then we can also give other examples, the shoulder joint and the hip joint. Shoulder, I think I've mentioned shoulder joint and the hip joint. hip joint. The hip joint. So in the in-between here around the hip girdle, hip region, can easily move this fluid, synovial fluid. We also have those drawings, so we don't have to repeat them again. Then something important to note still about joints. Something important to note about the joints. The structure that joins a bone to a muscle structure. So this is a very important point to note. Note the structure which joins a bone to a muscle, is called a tendon. It's called a tendon. Please you take note. Then the structure that joins and holds one bone to another. So that is note 1. Note number 2. A structure that joins and holds one bone to another. A structure that joins and holds one bone to another. One bone to another is called a ligament. It's called a ligament. Please you take note. It's called a ligament. You may be required to define what a tendon or to distinguish between a tendon and a ligament. Give the meaning of a tendon, ligament. So we have defined a tendon as a structure which joins a bone to a muscle. A structure that joins and holds one bone to another. We have called it a ligament. Then another point to note 3, a capsular ligament. A capsular ligament. So note 3, a capsular ligament. A capsular ligament is a tube of strong fibers. A tube of strong fibrous tissue joining bones to other bones. A tube of strong fibrous tissue joining bones together. So take note of these words or this terminology: capsular ligaments, a tube of strong fibrous tissue joining bones together. And the capsular ligament is important in keeping bones in place. Capsular ligament is important. It is important in keeping. Bones in place. And prevents. It keeps the bones in place and prevents their dislocation. And prevents their dislocation. during normal movement. During normal movement. During normal movement. That is the role of the scapular ligament. Keeping bones in position and preventing dislocation of the bones during normal movement. Then we also have synovial membrane. Synovial membrane. The synovial membrane. Synovial membrane. A synovial membrane, if you look at your drawings there, is clearly indicated, is a thin membrane which is a lining on the inside of the joint. A thin membrane, it is a thin membrane lining the inside, lining inside the joint, lining inside the joint. Thin membrane lining inside the joint. So the role of the synovial membrane, it is to secrete. It secretes the synovial fluid, right? So the synovial membrane secretes. This one secretes synovial fluid. Secretes synovial fluid. Remember what we said about synovial fluid? Synovial fluid is a fluid for lubrication. So the synovial membrane secretes synovial fluid that reduces friction, that reduces friction, reduces the friction between the joints, reduces friction, or you can say that lubricates, right? Lubricates the area where the two joints meet. Okay. Then you also have the articular cartilage. Roman 5, articular cartilage. The articular cartilage. Articular cartilage. Articular cartilage. So if these points are missing in your notes, please you add them. You add them. Articular cartilage. The articular cartilage, if you look at the drawing there, it is, you can define it as a tough and smooth connective tissue. A tough and smooth connective tissue. It is a tough and smooth connective tissue. It is a tough and smooth connective tissue covering the articular surface of bones. Covering the articular surface of bones. Articular surface of bones. Covering the articular surface of bones. Covering the articular surface of bones. Please you take note of those words. Articular cartilage, we have defined it as a tough and smooth connective tissue covering the articular surface of bones. The role of that articular cartilage, you can say it protects the end of the bones from wear and tear. So articular cartilage, the articular cartilage protects the end of the bone, from wear and tear. From wear and tear. Protects the end of the bone. So if you look at the structure of the bone, the structure of the bone. At the end of the bone, you have a tissue. There is tissue there. Soft tissue. Look at my drawing on board here. That structure there is what we are referring to as the articular cartilage. This cartilage is softer than bone. The role of the articular cartilage is to protect the end of the bone from wear and tear. The bone is not in direct contact with the other bone. So the in between the other bone and this bone, much as there is fluid in between, but again there is also that cartilage. So it prevents wear and tear. It is also lubricated by fluid, like we have said already, the synovial fluid. So that is our discussion about the joints. A lot we have discussed about the joints, the types of joints, and the classes of joints. Remember, we have talked about the types of joints as ball and socket joint, the hinge joint. Then we have also talked about the classes of the joints, movable joints and the immovable joints. Then under movable joints, we have also given the different examples of the movable joints as gliding joints, the pivot joints, and the synovial joints. So to add on, you need to know, since now we know what brings about movement now in the body, structures in the body that provides movement or make movement possible. So we need to move on and look at the action of muscles of the arm and the elbow joint. Action of muscles, the action of muscles. The action of muscles. Action of muscles. Action of muscles. At action of muscles of the arm. Action of muscles of the arm. At the elbow joint. At the elbow joint. At the elbow joint. Action of muscles of the arm. Right? I want us to all use our body parts well, right? In understanding the concepts of movement or locomotion. These features are part of our bodies. We need to make use of them very well as we study locomotion. So I want us to look at from your shoulder, the bone connecting the shoulder to the arm. The bone there is flat. It's called the scapular bone. It's a flat bone. So we need to know what brings about the changes that take place in your arm that bring about straightening, right? Straightening of the arm and bending. So we need to talk about flexing and extensing or extending of the arm. So we have that drawing as well, right? That drawing as well. I may not put it on board since we have it in our notes. So I want you to follow carefully. So the diagram showing muscles of the arm and associated bones, right? Muscles, the muscles of the arm, and the associated bones, muscles of the arm and the associated bones. Take note of that's where our point of interest lies. And the type of joint there. So the names of the muscles, very important, and the names of the bones there, and the type of joint. or the types of joints there. As far as this is concerned, we have this one here. There's that ball and socket joint. Then we have this one as the hinge joint. I mean the elbow joint. Elbow joint. So the joint there that we are interested in that brings about the straightening and the folding of the arm, right? We are looking at the elbow joint there, majorly. Elbow joint. Elbow joint. The elbow joints, much as you also look at this one here, right? The shoulder or the ball and socket joints. So for the arm, the bending and straightening of the arm, right? So bending and straightening of the arm. Point number one, bending and straightening of the arm. Bending and straightening. Straightening of the arm. Bending and straightening of the arm. Bending the arm. Bending and straightening of the arm. Remember, there are two muscles here. Here we have the biceps muscles, also known as flexor muscles. Then here you have the triceps muscles or the extensor muscles, right? So the two muscles there, remember that time we talked about muscles and the role of muscles in the body is to cause contraction and relaxation to bring about a change in position of the structure. So the bending and straightening of the arm at the elbow is brought about by the action of the two muscles. So bending and straightening of the arm is controlled by the action. It is controlled by the action of two types of muscles. Two types of muscles. And the two types of muscles in this case, we talk about the biceps, i.e. the biceps muscles. The biceps muscles, the ones we have called the flexor muscles, and the triceps muscles, they are also referred to as the extensor muscles. The extensor muscles. Remember, these are two different muscles that bring about different effects or effect to each other. Remember when we talked about muscles, we said the way muscles act, they antagonize, they bring about opposing effects to each other. So that mode of muscle action we refer to as being antagonistic. So they bring about opposing effects, antagonistic effects. We said as one contracts, the other one relaxes. So to bend or flex the arm. What happens when you bend or you flex the arm? So to bend or flex, the arm, Please you take note. To bend or flex the arm, the biceps muscles contract. Point one, biceps muscles contract. The biceps muscles contract. I.e., if you say they contract, they become shorter and fatter. I.e., they become shorter and fatter. Take note. You can say biceps muscles contract, meaning they become shorter and fatter. Meanwhile, triceps muscles relax. Triceps muscles, the triceps muscles relax. The triceps muscles relax, i.e., they become longer and thinner, i.e., become longer and thinner, longer and thinner. Those changes are very important as far as flexing or bending of the arm is concerned. Biceps muscles contract, meaning becoming shorter and fatter. That is if you are to bend the arm. While these triceps muscles on the other side, they relax, meaning become longer and thinner. Longer and thinner. Longer and thinner. So the contractions of the biceps muscles, contraction of the biceps muscles, contraction of the biceps muscle, the effect of the biceps muscle contracting pulls a bone called the radius, pulls the radius. If you look at your drawing of the skeleton, there's a bone labeled there as radius. So when the biceps muscles contract, they pull the radius with the ulna. Radius with the ulna. These are bones that lie close to each other. This brings about bending of the arm. This brings about bending of the arm. Brings about bending of the arm. Bending of the arm. So when that happens or when that takes place, biceps muscles contracting, becoming shorter, fatter, triceps muscles acting in the opposite direction, relaxing and becoming longer and thinner. Biceps muscles will have an effect on the ulna and radius, pulling it and causing the arm to bend. So that is the effect of muscles that cause the arm to bend or flex. Then, on the other hand, we also have to look at straightening of the arm. What changes or what effects do these muscles bring about to cause straightening of the arm? So to straighten the arm, or stretch the arm, or to stretch the arm, What happens to stretch the arm? Just for point of reminding ourselves, to straighten the arm, the opposite of bending is true for straightening. The opposite of bending is true for straightening. So what we say here, biceps muscles relax, right? In other words, they become longer and thinner. Meanwhile, the triceps muscles contract, become shorter and fatter, right? So to straighten in the arm, the triceps muscles contract. Triceps muscles contract. They contract. Triceps muscles contract. Meanwhile, the biceps muscles relax. Biceps muscles relax. The biceps muscles relax. Biceps muscles relax. So, contraction of the triceps muscles pull the ulna. Contraction of the triceps muscles pull the ulna. Pull the ulna. They pull the ulna with the radius. With the radius. Pull the ulna with the radius. They pull the ulna with the radius. And the result is straightening of the arm. So this results in straightening. This results in straightening of the arm. This results in straightening of the arm. Results in straightening of the arm. So please take note how muscles of the arm at the elbow bring about bending and straightening. There are basically two muscles you're talking about. The biceps muscles and the triceps muscles, and the two bones there, radius bone and the ulnar bone. The effect is on those two muscles contracting, relaxing, or acting antagonistically. Antagonistic action, we said, is a mode of action where muscles bring about opposing effects to each other. So I want us to apply the same knowledge as well. We talk of muscles at the long shin bones here. So that is basically locomotion and movement of the arm in humans, right? Arm in humans. Next, we can also talk about locomotion in birds. Locomotion in birds. Locomotion in birds. Locomotion in birds. The remaining about 25 minutes, you can do locomotion in birds. Locomotion in birds. Locomotion in birds. Locomotion in birds. In the senior one, we talked about aves. The aves. Birds are capable of walking. Birds are capable of running. Birds are capable of swimming, right? So birds can run, fly, swim, right? So they are able to swim. We have the swimming birds. We have those that can walk or run, but are unable to fly. The ostrich is a very good example of a bird that walks or runs on the surface, on the ground surface. It's unable to fly, but it's a bird. We have birds that swim. They live partly on land, they are terrestrial, and they are aquatic. They go in water and they are able to swim, right? Their body structures that make them swim or live an aquatic life, right, are so unique. Like for those swimming birds, they have webbed feet, so they can swim with ease. The duck is an example, or members of the duck family. Then we have birds, majority of the birds are able to fly. Fly, right? They can fly. So birds can run, swim, and fly. However, the most characteristic form of locomotion in birds is by flight, right? So the most characteristic form of locomotion, take note, the most characteristic form of locomotion, most characteristic form of locomotion in birds is by flight. So I want us to pay a lot of attention to flight in birds. What brings about flight? It is something very unique. It is something very special about birds. Keeping that weight in space and for over a long distance, moving over a long distance, right? So, and most birds have the power to fly, or the power of flight. So in birds, the forelimbs are modified into wings, right? In birds, the forelimbs are modified. They are modified into wings. They are modified into wings. They don't have arms as humans have, but they are forelimbs. Yeah? The forelimbs, what you would call maybe the arms, are modified into wings. They are modified into wings, and their skin is covered. It's covered by feathers. It is covered by feathers. Their body is covered by feathers. Their skin is covered with feathers. The wings have a very large surface area and very little weight, right? So the wings of a bird provide a large surface area with very little weight. So the wings provide a very large surface area, with little weight. You know, I have said they have the body covered by feathers. There are different types of feathers on the body of the bird. We may look at those different types of feathers later on. So some few examples of birds have both the wings and feathers, but are unable to fly. So such birds are referred to as flightless birds, right? Those that have both wings and feathers but are unable to fly. I give you an example of the ostrich. It has the wings and the feathers, but it's a very heavy bird. Maybe the reason why it is unable to fly, it's because of the mass, the body mass. It's a very heavy bird. It can't lift its body off the ground. And maybe the size of the wings are not large enough, right? They're not large enough to provide that strong surface area for flight and keeping it in space. So such examples of birds that are unable to fly are flightless birds. They are flightless birds. So the examples there we can give of the flightless birds, the flightless birds. Flightless birds, like we have said, they have the wings, they have the feathers, but they are unable to fly. So flightless birds, we can give examples: ostrich, the kiwi, right? Kiwi. I believe most of us have seen an ostrich physically. Those who have had an opportunity to see a kiwi, those are somehow rare here in Uganda, but we can find them in Kenya. Ostrich, we have them in our game reserves and national parks, and maybe we can find them commonly in the zoo at Entebbe, right? So we have the kiwi, the ostrich, and the emus. Those are flightless birds. They are unable to fly. So the only mechanism of locomotion they rely on is by walking. They live entirely on land. So they walk, they run, right? They run. So next, we can also look at the adaptations of birds for movement in air. Those that fly. Adaptations of birds for movement in air. By flight. by flight. For movement in air by flight. For movement in air by flight. For movement in air by flight. What keeps that bird in space? How able is it to keep in space for long? What special and unique features do they have? Right? One, we have already said that their four limbs are modified into wings. Right? Four limbs are modified into wings. Modified into wings. With feathers, right? Modified into wings with feathers. They are modified into wings with feathers. The forelimbs modified into wings with feathers, which provide a large surface area for movement in air. Which provides a large surface area, which provide a large surface area, which provides a large surface area for movement in air. For movement in air. For movement in air. So their forelimbs, take note, they are wings with feathers. So having wings means there's a large surface area for movement in air. They are good at flapping their wings when they are in space or when they are in air, right? The wings are large to provide a large surface area for movement in air. Two, the endoskeleton. These birds they have an endoskeleton. They have many bones. They have many bones. So the endoskeleton is made of small hollow bones. The endoskeleton is made of many or numerous small bones, small hollow bones. Add the word hollow. Small hollow bones. Small hollow bones. What is being hollow? Many of us eat birds, right? Many of us eat the birds and you enjoy the bird. And when you eat, especially the long bones of the birds, especially of the leg, right? The leg of the bird. You always find some bit of space in it. That space makes the body of the bird lighter, less heavy. So they have many bones that are hollow, which make it light for easy flight. Hollow bones which reduce the weight of the bird, when in space or when in air. Which reduce the weight, of the bird. Reduce the weight of the bird. Reduce the weight of the bird during flight. Number 3, their bones, I beg your pardon, their bodies are streamlined. So number 3, adaptation number 3, birds have a streamlined body. Streamlined body. Meaning what? Streamlined body. If you look at the shape of most birds, from the head, from the beak to the head to the back, it is streamlined. Streamlined body in shape, reducing air resistance. They have a streamlined body to reduce, or you can use another alternative word, minimize air resistance. minimize air resistance. Minimize air resistance during flight. Minimize air resistance during flight. During flight. Minimize air resistance during flight. That is why they can easily move with ease, meaning air just passes past the body without causing any kind of resistance. Next, birds have a rigid and firm skeleton. They have a rigid and firm endoskeleton. They have a rigid and firm endoskeleton. The skeleton is hard. It has a degree of hardness and firmness. So being hard provides surface for attachment of the flight muscles, right? So it has a rigid and firm skeleton made up of, can say, rigid and firm skeleton, endoskeleton, to provide a surface, for attachment, of the flight muscles. Then you can also add another adaptation. They have large and powerful flight muscles. Have large and powerful flight muscles. Large and powerful flight muscles. The flight muscles in birds have a collective name as pectoral muscles. The pectoral muscles have large and powerful flight muscles, the pectoral muscles, for flapping or depressing the wings in flight. For flapping and depressing the wings. For flapping and depressing the wings during flight. For flapping and depressing the wings during flight. Then birds have a large sternum. Birds have a large sternum. That is the breastbone. Sternum in the birds is a large bone, or the breastbone. They have a large sternum, or call it breastbone. Look at the bone of the bird. Sternum bone, right? Very large. So that sternum bone with a deep keel, have a large sternum or breastbone with a deep keel. Which provides a large surface area for attachment of flight muscles. Which provides a large surface area. It provides a large surface area for attachment of flighty muscles. Then another adaptation, birds have a high metabolic rate. They have a high metabolic rate they have a very high metabolic rate. The purpose of having, or the benefit of having a very high metabolic rate ensures that there is production of energy, because flight is energy consuming. Flight is an energy consuming process. So they need continuous supply. They need continuous supply of what? Energy. So they have a very high metabolic rate to generate the energy required to generate the energy required. Generate energy required for flight. Energy required for flight. Generate the energy required for flight. Another adaptation can also give, besides having a large metabolic rate, the lungs of birds have numerous air sacs. The lungs of birds have numerous air sacs. Their lungs have extra air sacs, air bags. Air sacs attached to them, which provides a large surface area for efficient gaseous exchange. Which provides a large surface area for efficient gaseous exchange. Efficient gaseous exchange. For efficient gaseous exchange at great heights and speed in air. At great heights and speed in air. So if you look at the lungs of birds, there are extra sacs, air sacs. Those extra sacs, or the air sacs attached on the lungs of birds, provide large surface area for gaseous exchange. Making gaseous exchange very efficient. Because during flight, there is great demand and supply. For oxygen to the muscles, to the respiring muscles, the flight muscles. So for them, they have made it a better method of easing exchange by having or developing air sacs. Okay, so the other one, birds have a high red blood cell count. They have a high red blood cell count. Meaning they have the ability to generate many red blood cells. The role of the red blood cell, if you remember from your transport, right? Red blood cells are concerned with the transportation of oxygen in the body. So for them having very many red blood cells in their blood means there is efficient transportation of what? Oxygen in the body. So they have very many red blood cells for efficient transportation of oxygen. For efficient transportation of oxygen required for respiration. Oxygen required for tissue respiration or cell respiration. Required for tissue respiration or cell respiration, for energy production. For energy production. Then You can also add, they have a very keen sense of sight. Birds have a very keen or strong sense of sight. They have a very keen sense of sight, sharp eyesight. They have a keen sense of sight, strong vision, strong vision, strong vision to dodge and avoid obstacles, avoid obstacles during flight and when landing, it is very hard for birds to collide with obstacles in space. They always land with care because they always look at where they are landing. So what enables them to achieve that? Having a keen sense of sight, strong vision to dodge, avoid obstacles, avoiding damaging their bodies. Then lastly, or second last, you can say, their red blood cells contain a pigment called myoglobin. Their red blood cells contain a pigment called myoglobin. Myoglobin, remember I talked of other pigments as hemoglobin, but they have another pigment called myoglobin, which has a high affinity for oxygen, for releasing and taking up oxygen. Then most birds fold their legs backwards. Most birds fold or they bend their legs backwards to prevent air resistance during flight, prevent air resistance during flight. They always fold and keep their legs within the wings. So to avoid, they don't spread or leave their legs spread, but they bend them, fold them within the wings to minimize air resistance, to move swiftly during flight. Then lastly, they have an efficient blood circulatory system. They have a very efficient blood circulatory system. They have a very efficient blood circulatory system for quick transportation of the required nutrients and oxygen. For quick transportation and supply of nutrients and oxygen to the respiring cells and tissues. Oxygen to cells, those are the muscles, the flight muscles and tissues. So basically, those are the adaptations of birds for movement in air. So today, I beg we stop there. Next time we meet, we shall look at the different types of feathers, their positions on the body, their functions on the body. Otherwise, wish you a nice day and remind you that we observe the SOPs and keep safe.